complexity of attacks against our networks really around the globe continue to increase. The dynamic tension that exists between usability and cybersecurity is something that is very real. So we want to make sure that our tools are still usable while safe at the same time.
Everyone needs to be a part of cybersecurity, and everybody needs to own a piece of it.
As we bring more capabilities online, every one of those additional things that we add to our networks is another potential attack vector. So we have to be very careful about how we are securing those things and how we're keeping them updated against new and emerging threats.
A lot of the issues that we're facing are not even the most technically complex problems. We just want to throw really technical solutions at them.
General IT security focus has been on the network. We're going to have to start paying attention to hardware configuration security more.
Understanding where your gear is coming from and who's touching it before you get it and put it into use in your systems is critically important.
Having real conversations about what the threats are, real conversations about what it is that we are solving for is unbelievably important.
All right. Well, thank you very much for everyone for joining us here. We're really excited about having everybody, folks. What of you? We got a beautiful morning to kick off for our CXO Tech Forum, State of Cyber. We're really excited about the agenda and the host of speakers that we have today. And we're really tackling an important issue right now. It's October, as everyone I think very well knows. It's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So what we wanted to do is really shine a light on a lot of the issues that affect government agencies with cybersecurity, whether that means healthcare, national security, quite a host of different issues that we want to explore today with the panels that we have, the fireside chats, and some of the one-on-ones. So we're very excited to have you here. Like I said, beautiful venue. Thank you very much to the observation deck for making this possible for us today. But I also wanted to thank our sponsors that really made this possible. We have ID Technologies, APCO Worldwide, and Cylance. Without their support, none of this could really be possible. So I wanted to just take a second, if everyone could give a round of applause to those folks, and, as well as the speakers we have today. Thank you. So we have quite a packed lineup, so I'm going to keep my comments short. But what I wanted to do first is, we're still a new player in this area. Government CIO Media, we invite everybody to go visit our website. We have a multitude of platforms, whether it's our website, our video interviews, our podcasts, and live events like you're here today. So we really, as you'll see in the program, we really want you guys to provide us feedback. This is a really important time for us to understand what you guys are interested in and what you want more of. So please, I really urge you. Sometimes you see people ask for feedback and they don't really mean it. We mean it. We really want to know what you guys are thinking about the platform that we're putting together here. So without further ado, one last thing. We have our event here today. I also wanted to give a quick plug to our next event, which is going to be focused on artificial intelligence. That's going to be on November 13th. It's going to be here as well. And we want to make sure that, if you enjoyed the event here, you're here as well. So without further ado, I want to invite the first speakers. What we're going to do is we're going to have Kirsten Todd and Roger Cressy come to the front. They're the hosts of one of our new podcasts, Cybercast, which hopefully you folks have downloaded and been able to listen to. What they're going to do is do a fireside chat here with DHS Undersecretary Chris Krebs. So I'll hand it off to you here, Kirsten. Thank you.
We're going to do a fireside chat when it's 85 degrees outside.
How do you feel?
Very nice.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Chris, thanks very much. Great to have you. And as always with current events, whenever you seem to speak, there's always something that's happened that's important in cybersecurity. But you're doing a tremendous job, and it's great we're excited to have the conversation. I think for those of you who don't know, Chris was appointed to lead the National Programs and Protectorate Directorate for DHS in June. He may have a new role coming up soon, given the passage of the CISA legislation in the Senate last night. Still has a little bit more work to do, but he's had senior roles in the Bush administration as well as in the private sector. And I think everybody who's been following this issue, particularly for the last year and a half, knows that you've done tremendous work in the agency, a lot of efforts underway, a lot of leadership. We're fortunate to have you, and we have a lot of questions to ask. Thanks very much for being here. So just to start with what happened last night. So obviously it's still got to go back into the House because of some of the add-ons that happened in the House, but it passed the Senate, the CISA legislation. What does that mean for you when you look at your current efforts that are underway, but also for your future agenda if this agency ultimately passes?
So first and foremost, it means only about 4 more weeks do I have to go by the incomprehensible and unpronounceable National Protection and Programs Directorate.
Which I think I actually probably switched around.
You did. I've made a bad joke that it sounds like a Soviet-era military intelligence agency, NKVD, NPPD. It's pretty much the same. But first and foremost, it does just that. It clarifies and clearly signifies our mission. And so when I go out there and my team goes out there and engages stakeholders, principally the private sector critical infrastructure community, it makes the icebreaker that much easier. We don't have to explain what a Protection and Programs Directorate means. Instead, it's, hey, we're with DHS and we're the National Cybersecurity Agency, effectively. So it breaks that down immediately. It also is going to help significantly in terms of recruiting. There have been a number of job fairs where we've had signs that say DHS or National Protection Programs Directorate. Nobody knows what that means. So it'll actually make, just from a right out the gate recruiting perspective, make things easier. But probably most importantly, it streamlines the organization. So NPPD, when it was established in 2007, was almost like an island of misfit toys. It was a conglomeration of disparate programs, security programs within DHS that didn't neatly fit within TSA or FEMA or other established legacy agencies. It was more of kind of the emerging space. In addition to the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, which was quite small in 2007, both budgetary and resource and personnel-wise, it also included the Office of Infrastructure Protection, which was a bit of the big dog, and then the Office of Biometric Identity Management, then called US Visit, and then ultimately it also brought in the Federal Protective Service. So you had this suite of programs that if you step back, you could look and you could say, yeah, they all fit together. But in terms of mission, they didn't actually directly align. So over time, as the threat landscape, particularly from a cybersecurity perspective, has evolved and the department's role has been clarified and strengthened by Congress, it really became clear that the department needed a single voice, a single agency or organization that was able to carry out the Secretary's critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity authorities. And that brings us to today. So the Office of Biometric Identity Management will shift over to the Office of Management. And then FPS, the Federal Protective Service, which guards and protects GSA leased and loaned facilities, there's a kind of an off-ramp or a transition process. All of these are critically important missions for the department and the broader security enterprise, but they're not core to the mission of CISA or CISA. So lots more to do in terms of transitioning and getting to fully operational capability. But that one right out the gate, getting the name change is just so critical for the organization.
So as you look at some of the efforts that you're working on right now, and it's interesting because how will this translate into the new agency, but election security. So you've been focused on that arguably more than any other individual in government, both in the past as well as looking into the future for cybersecurity. Yesterday you talked about how the trust between the federal government and state and local government has improved significantly, and that you're looking at these elections as being the most secure elections in our nation's history. Can you talk a little bit about how trust facilitates security and who's doing it right at the state level? What have you seen that's effective, that gives you hope for 2018?
Right. So in 2016, when the intelligence community got an understanding of what was going on and how the Russian intelligence agencies were attempting and actually in some cases infiltrated state election infrastructure, when you had that intelligence and the senior officials approached state officials at the time, first it took a while to figure out who to talk to. The concept that secretaries of state administered elections was not something that DHS or the intelligence community knew. There was an agency within the U.S. federal government that had a very deep understanding of that, and that's the Election Assistance Commission. The problem is no one in DHS knew that the Election Assistance Commission actually existed in and of itself. So there was a lot of, that old adage of emergency response or incident response. You don't want to be exchanging business cards at the incident zone or in the EOC. That was happening digitally, at least. So we've gotten past that. We understand the landscape and who the players are, and we've established partnership mechanisms, communication protocols, so that if now I have a piece of intelligence, actionable intelligence, I know who to go to in every single state. Whether it's the Secretary of State, a senior election official, the Homeland Security Advisor, the state CIO, and the governor, we know who to hit, and we can do it quickly, whether they have a clearance or not. If they have a clearance, great. If they don't, I can do one-day read-ins, or, you know what? One way or the other, we'll get it to them and we'll deal with the consequences on classification later.
So you said Island of Misfit Toys. You want to volunteer who was the Charlie in the box?
No comment.
That's what I thought.
Look, all of the missions, and I think Governor Ridge is well acquainted with how the department came together, but every one of the missions within DHS serves a critical purpose. What we need to do 15 years into the department is ensure that we're properly aligned across the mission space to achieve those security outcomes we want. And that's the primary objective of the CISA legislation.
So just as in working on the legislation to create DHS, I will tell you that back in 2001, the intent and the threat landscape was so different than what it is right now. And when we were in the Senate and putting that together, there was no way we could have envisioned what the threat looks like today. And so even though it's only been 17 years, in history, that's not a very long period of time. If you look at the intent of that legislation and why we were bringing together the entities that we were, it's considerably different.
Build on that just for a second. Really, when I step back and I look at the significance of 2016 and the Russian efforts to interfere with the election, it was not just an awakening for the intelligence community. I think the American public actually, it was a galvanizing moment. I've said this before. Prior to that, my sense of things was that cybersecurity, if you're not a practitioner, if you're to the layperson, cybersecurity had been an intellectual property issue where the Chinese are stealing our good ideas, the North Koreans are smash and grabbing on banks, Russia's doing something over there, whatever it is. It had always been kind of this ephemeral, intangible threat. The 2016 elections, it was an awakening because it was the first time I think people actually realized that cybersecurity could destabilize our government. And it really shook people to the core. And as a result, what I've seen across the interagency with the intelligence community, the FBI, the State Department, all the players across the board have oriented towards that goal of we're not fighting amongst each other, we have a common adversary. And what's it going to take to align capabilities, resources to not just get it done as a federal government, but also support state and local governments?
So let's talk strategy. There's always been criticism that we don't have a strategy on cybersecurity. Well, today we have now the DHS strategy, we now have the DoD strategy, and we now have a new national cybersecurity strategy, which I think John Bolton is saying was the first one since 2002, 2003. Probably the most significant thing that I saw out of all these documents is the concept of defending forward, which is what DoD is talking about now. In effect, carrying the fight to the enemy a little bit sooner than we have in the past, not being as reactive. We've seen press reports that PBD 20 has now been superseded by NSPM 13. There's your government bureaucratic acronym moment for all of you. And that we are now in a position where DoD is going to go in and address threats that are happening from the source. So 2 questions for DHS on this. How do you guys play into that? How does it affect you? And what do you do with the private sector? Because I think one of the concerns has always been, a little bit overblown, but it's still there, that if the government's going to go in, the private sector needs to be notified of this to a certain degree and needs to understand the consequences if the adversary decides to respond either asymmetrically or just in a different sector altogether. How is the coordination mechanism going to work on that?
So when you step back and you look at the complete deterrence package across the federal government, there's a suite of options, both military but also diplomatic, financial, and that's from a cost imposition perspective. My team sits squarely in the deterrence by denial space. We look to work with the private sector to up the defenses. The problem is, when you live on a street of glass houses, yeah, we may have the biggest rocks, but we also have the biggest glass house. So how do we work with the private sector to make the house a little less glassy? One of the things we did over the course of the summer was announce the establishment of the National Risk Management Center. And what that was, in effect, was taking an existing organization within, or a subcomponent within NPPD, my team, that was kind of a back office risk analytics shop that took some demand signal and generated good analytic products. But the connectivity with the private sector wasn't necessarily what it needed to be. So we reoriented the agenda setting for this organization and boosted the resources to be more private sector informed. And that is consistent with the broader philosophy that I'm bringing to the organization is we're not doing anything, for the most part, without having a clear set of requirements established by the private sector and our critical infrastructure partners. Everything I do is voluntary. And the key to a voluntary partnership is you have to have partners on both sides. So for someone to work with me, they have to get value out of the engagement. So to define that value, we have to figure out what the requirements are, set a demand signal, align our capabilities against that demand signal, and ultimately pop out the other side, something of benefit to the private sector partner. So the National Risk Management Center, again, was that attempt to bring a storefront that private sector could come in through, and not from a specific piece of intelligence. I've got the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. Lots of centers, I get it. But the end kick is focused on defending today, taking care of the worms and the malware and all that good stuff that's burning across the globe right now. The National Risk Management Center is focused on tomorrow, securing tomorrow, figuring out what the strategic risks are to our critical infrastructure, and bringing together the groups and the partnerships that we need to ensure that the next deployment, whether it's the rollout of 5G or the next pipeline or whatever it is, has security baked in by design.
So when you look at the National Risk Management Center, what you've done is you've launched it with these three sectors: energy, telecom, and finance. How are you structuring this center in a way where, so we have the age-old problem where industry says, we're giving you this information, but what are we getting in return? So you're talking about looking at, okay, what's the intel that you're going to kick back out? What are you envisioning for that offering that government's going to provide? I know Intel Collection, and Bob Kolowski, who's running it, is talking about Intel Collection. That's my first question. My second question is, you took three legacy infrastructure sectors who, for all intents and purposes, are doing it right. I mean, they've modeled good behavior, whether it's CRISP at energy, all the financial infrastructure, what telecom is doing. Have you thought about bringing in those sectors that need a little bit more help, because would they get more out of government, and would that balance actually help identify what government can offer?
So ultimately what we want to get to a lot, but my mentality with the shift in the Risk Management Center was a bit of a startup mentality. It wasn't fully baking the cake, taking a year to develop the strategy, the implementation plan, the objectives, goals, the charter, all of that stuff that was going to take a long time to do. And instead, let's start this up small with a core group of dedicated partners that want to lean in, that want to be co-located with us or us co-located with them, and start having some small scale but significant wins. Playing small ball, right? Singles and doubles, driving in runs, building confidence to launch to bigger success stories down the road. So we did start at the core with the tri-sector, energy, comms, and finance. But we also have other smaller scale, at the moment, projects that will lead into bigger things. We announced on Tuesday, yesterday, actually, morning, the Pipeline Security Initiative, working with pipeline and natural gas operators alongside the Department of Energy, Transportation Security Administration. It's providing focused support and intelligence to these efforts, again, to ensure the longer-term critical infrastructure space. Now, we're doing this through a series of sprints. We've got 3 or 4 sprints right out the gate, 90-day organization efforts. One of the sprints is actually just developing a charter for the organization and a governance model of how industry and government will work together. But also the tri-sector working group will kick off kind of a risk registry process. And that is, again, it's getting, you mentioned all these different sectors coming in. The 16-sector model under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan is a critical and important and useful organizing construct on how to work day-to-day issues with the sector. But at the same time, we have to be real with ourselves that there are some sectors that pose a greater degree of risk to our nation and our economy. So in the government, we have mission essential functions, those things the government has to deliver on a daily basis to ensure our constitutional democracy carries forward. What we don't have, what are those equivalent functions that come out of industry? So that is one of the other sprints that we're working through the Risk Management Center is across the 16 sectors, what are those key functions? Some sectors will have more functions than others that industry has to deliver to ensure our economy keeps clicking and whirring. And the example I always bring up is in the financial services industry. It's not necessarily the ATMs and cash availability, but it is clearing wholesale payments at the end of the day. It's treasuries and pricing. It's those things that drive the global economy. So we've got to build this understanding of what risk really is across our infrastructure community. And in doing so, we have to move away from this model that a single infrastructure asset or a single institution or organization is the organizing concept. We've got to get to what the service delivery is and who makes that up. And in part, what we'll find is there are organizations that we probably didn't have the relationship or the engagement that we needed to have. And there will also be boutique and customized services and capabilities across that function.
So you talked about the NKIC, worrying about the here and now threat. And in some of your testimony, you've highlighted the threat to ICS, industrial control systems, and calling out the Russians, as you and others have done, about specifically doing strategic reconnaissance on infrastructure. Data destruction, I think, is now something that people understand in the aftermath of the Ukraine, and certainly with Saudi Arabia and Qatar a few years before that. How are you looking at that threat challenge right now, and what do you think needs to be done, A, to deal with what the Russians are doing on strategic reconnaissance, but B, how do we better strengthen our ICS infrastructure to make it more resilient to the current threat environment?
So in the operational technology or ICS space, I think the security conversation is I don't want to say a little bit behind where the IT space is, but it's just a different ecosystem and it's a different surface area. Maybe somebody thinks it is behind, but we'll come back to that. So where we're looking is getting a better understanding of how these threats work and how the access works. And so we spent a lot of time over the last several months working with the Department of Energy and some of the labs to understand what it looks like across the IT/OT domains, how adversaries are making hops and the sorts of things. It's really hard to actively monitor, at least from our capabilities right now, what's going on in the OT space just because of the fragility of it and the life safety implications. So we're working with, as I mentioned, the labs to get that better understanding and a number of the security companies. It is a smaller group. When you think about the actual ICS manufacturers, it is a much narrower set of stakeholders that are all forward-leaning and engaged, and we can work that through the Industrial Control Systems CERT that we host out of DHS, but also there are other players across the federal interagency. Last summer, when we first encountered and disclosed the Russian activities across ICS, we issued a number of alerts and then another one in the spring. I think it was a very unimaginative title, something like Russian activity across critical infrastructure. It was a technical alert. The interesting story is that it really was it was one of the better examples of how the adversary is not necessarily knocking on the front door. The Russians work the supply chain really, really well. NotPetya was another example with the infiltration of MEDOC. But they were working through suppliers and vendors to energy companies to get into the energy company networks. And so what is increasingly important is that we don't go back into a pre-9/11 siloed approach to intelligence and information sharing. We have to bring the total picture together. As soon as we got indicators out of the energy companies that we knew had some compromises, we were able to splash that out and send those alerts out, and it just lit up an entire campaign across about half the sectors: aviation, transportation, construction, and it just speaks to the need to fuse information. No single piece of information is too small. Let us stitch together the bigger common operating picture, the bigger mosaic of activity to get an understanding of what the adversary is doing, and we can work the problem a lot faster.
I know we're running out of time. Before Roger wraps up, I want to just kind of take that in a little bit of a different direction for a moment. So last year, you made an ISAC for elections, and so deeming the elections being critical. And you just talked about no piece of information not being unimportant, every piece of information being important. In light of that, and in light of the evolving threat environment, if we look at companies that are in social media, if you look at Facebook, if you look at others who are arguably having a greater impact in some ways on our national and economic security than we could anticipate, how are you starting to see critical infrastructure evolve? When Mark Zuckerberg came to the Senate in March, he talked about the R word. He talked about regulation. He said, we've got to work together. And there is a need here, right? When you talk about information, that company in particular, but there are others, are aggregating this information. It's coming through. Their business model was not developed to really work in national and economic security. What's the vision as technology companies like Facebook come down the pike for how to work with them and how to start to define this area of technology as being critical?
So a couple thoughts here. One is, everyone's now an IT company. Just the edges are blurring on what is a true IT company. We just launched earlier this week some technical alerts about managed service providers and how adversaries have compromised those managed service providers and able to hop into their customers and again, IP theft. But stepping back even further, I mentioned it earlier, I'm thinking about things through two lenses. One is defending today, the second is securing tomorrow. How do we take care of today's risk and security threats and to ensure that today we don't have issues, and then what does the future look like? So regulation is not something that I tend to have in my vocabulary right now because it's not my authority set. And if I've learned anything, I can't expect to ask for something legislatively and get it quickly. The name change is literally taken about 3 or 4 years, a name change. So let's say we can even get a legislative package through Congress. The regulatory process under the Administrative Procedures Act is going to take another 2 years. So we're talking about several years. But what we have to do is ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can as the federal government to enable private sector to defend itself, to protect itself from what we're increasingly calling a collective defense model. But to do that effectively, it does require the private sector to come forward. I'll go back to 2016 in the election hacking. That was a pivotal moment, not just for government, but for industry as well, in awakening. That it's no longer about cyber criminals or IP theft. It is a potentially existential threat to our country, to our infrastructure, to our government. And the shift in, or the increased willingness of organizations to come sit down with us, to sit down with the IC and DoD and figure this problem set out, I don't think I actually expected it to be as much vigor in these engagements as we're actually seeing right now.
And that's an encouraging sign. And another sign is we are out of time. I want to thank you, as always, for taking the time to speak with us. We thank you for your service. You're doing a great job at DHS. Continue to push the rock up the hill. Every day is a small incremental progress. But thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
All
All right, if I could have Governor Ridge join me here. So Governor Ridge, here, let me grab my... Governor Tom Ridge here doesn't need much of an introduction. Okay, perfect. Governor Ridge doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to try to make one anyway, because I feel like it wouldn't be right otherwise. So Governor Ridge, longtime governor of Pennsylvania, as a former resident of Pennsylvania, it's an honor to join you here, sir. But it's just been, you've had a storied career, going back to your service in the Vietnam War, being drafted and earning a Bronze Star of Valor out of Harvard University. What a career! I mean, you have your time as the governor there, and then in 2001, following the attacks of 9/11, named the director of the Office of Homeland Security, serving there 2 years before it became a cabinet level position, becoming the secretary of the department. So. I don't think we need much more, but
well, if you look at it, you say the guy can't hold a job.
Governor Ridge now serves as the chairman of Ridge Global and also works with APCO Worldwide as a senior advisor. Yep. So, what we wanted to do was kind of talk about where DHS has been and where it's going during our time here with you today. So let's start there. How do you believe the role of the Secretary for Homeland Security has changed from 2003 to today?
Well, I think first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and to all of you who are presently in public service. I know you got a lot of private sector here, but for those of you who are probably public service, I just want to say thank you. Particularly in light of the challenges that you face now, because it's a far more perilous world today than it was in 2001. Not only has the terrorist threat metastasized and become far more complex and geographically far more diverse, but the traditional nation-state kind of adversaries have exploded with Russia and China and Iran, and the destabilization of Europe, and the list goes on. And then finally, the world in which you live in is so dramatically affected by the digital, what I call the digital forevermore. Article 1, I think Section 8, it gives Congress the right to declare war. Well, we're not going to do it, but we're at war. It's a digital war. When I was in the military, it was air, land, and sea. Then we went to space. The fifth theater of war is the digital space, and we're in one, and it's not declared. I don't want to be breathless or alarmist about it, but the Chinese and the Russians actually in their written doctrine, war-fighting doctrine, relate to that as a component. We know that Rouhani in Iran has gone to universities recruiting cyber warriors to defeat their adversaries. So all of you out there in the public sector working on this digital challenge, I want to tip my hat to you. A lot of people go to work every day and they add value to our economy. They make widgets, gadgets, and gadgets. They offer services, but you go to work protecting the infrastructure and your government. And I don't want to demean anything anybody else does, but when you park your car, I was out at NASA the other day, and there was just literally thousands of cars, and I thought, what a great mindset. I got to tell these folks, when they go to work, their job, although they're not wearing a military uniform, is to help protect America. And I think we need to understand and respect that a little bit more than we do. Let's face it, the digital world the digital opportunities to disrupt for political or geopolitical reasons is real. We've done it. We can't walk into equity court and say, well, we've never done it. It's called Stuxnet, when we tried to slow down Iranian's nuclear program. So Teddy Roosevelt once said, one of the best prizes in life is to work hard at work worth doing. Well, those of you in this digital world, on behalf of the government, you work hard. But I got to tell you, it's work worth doing, so I tip my hat to you. The challenges in DHS have just grown exponentially. I think my successors have had to deal with not only trying to work with Congress as they still try to get the department arranged the way they'd like it, and it has become the political piñata in this town, which I take great offense to. If you got a problem with immigration, let's blame Let's game DHS. You got a problem at the airport, it's TSA, it's DHS. It's a favorite whipping post for the Congress of the United States. And only until they're able to reduce the jurisdictional oversight of the department and get people who understand how it's all connected, will we ever be able to maximize the collective energy, effort, and intellect of the department. So my successors, I thought I had a tough job. I think my successor's job has been more complicated than mine. But I'm glad President Bush called me. By the way, we wrote the job description after I said yes. So if you're going to do a job interview, figure out what you get into before you say yes.
So back during those years, in 2003, I looked up the statistic. It was estimated, according to a CNN article, cybercrimes cost the country $16 billion, or I should say worldwide. Last year, it was $6 trillion.
Yep.
So how have you seen digital threats evolve over the past 15 years?
Well, I think we all know who the actors are. I mean, your nation states, your hacktivists, your organized crime. Frankly, some of them are devoting more assets than, frankly, we do in this country, at least from a government level. And the other thing I think we need to understand about the digital world is, I'll bet just about everybody in here is wearing a watch. We have watches. The digital hackers and actors have time. So they'll play around in the network. They're probably already in most of the networks, looking for that vulnerability. As the internet, John Chambers said it right, it's not the Internet of Things, it's the Internet of everything. I've seen some incredible estimates that by 2020, there'll be 20 billion devices hooked up to the Internet. And I saw another estimate that said 50 billion. Now, I don't know whether it's 20 or 50. I'm a guy from Erie, Pennsylvania. All I know, it's a lot. And the other thing I know is everyone is a potential point of access into the Internet. And so I think we need to understand that they're patient. They're changing their technology. We're finding more and more often that they're designing malware for a particular target. It used to be generic malware. We tried here and there. Again, some of these are organized and supported by government. They've got research dollars. They literally have thousands and thousands of people working on it. And others are just organized crime where their government looks the other way. So the digital sun, let me put it this way, the digital sun's never going to set. It's just going to get hotter and hotter, which means to be more aggressive, more tools, more sophisticated. And while I appreciate what Homeland Security is trying to do to build those relationships with the private sector, and they need to do that, the most important thing that the government can do for the private sector is share information as quickly as possible. That's the most important thing they can do, and help accelerate the construction of these information sharing analysis centers. You got telecom's got a good one, financial services has one of the best, energy's starting to work, but the other sectors are kind of slow. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But we need to understand, without being breathless, we're at war. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. And the other thing the private sector, I think, needs to understand, you're not going to have, the government can give you information, and there's a lot of companies, listen, when we did, pardon the monologue, but let me
by all means.
When we worried about physical threats way back when, 02, 03, you say, okay, can you identify the threat? Can you detect it? Can you prevent it? And if all else fails, then you got to respond and recover. I think one of the challenges today in the mindset is we're spending a little bit too much time on respond and recover, and we're not spending enough time on, can we identify the threat? Can we detect it and prevent it? And I will tell you, if you take a look at the statistics, the greatest point of vulnerability is either your employees or your third-party contractors have access to your network. Now, you don't need the government to tell you that. I just did, and it was free. But we need to understand that. I mean, this year so far, there have been 4 or 5 interesting developments. There were like 140 or 150 universities in the United States were attacked, and they got through because several professors just went fishing. Professors went fishing. Or third-party contacts. They get it through. I mean, we all know, I guess, was targeted through the heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So private sector has to start thinking, not just who do I call if something happens. You got to start worrying on the front end. The barbarians are no longer at the gate. They're exquisitely concealed. You need to understand that and act on it before you have to pick up the phone and call somebody and say, help me. I've been hacked.
No, absolutely. One of the big focuses that we've seen with cybersecurity, one of the big concerns is protecting critical infrastructure. Yep. I think you certainly had an interesting situation in August of 2003 when we had the Northeast blackout. Yep. And that wasn't necessarily because of a cybersecurity attack. It was more because of a tree limb, right? But at the same time, it shows how when the lights go out across the entire Northeast, what are some of the implications of that? Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about
I love that.
Maybe the phone call that you had?
It's a story I say with a smile on my face, although it affected 55 million people who didn't have energy for like 2 weeks or 2 days. I'm out and about, and I get a call from the White House, and obviously the operator says the president's on the line. By the way, I knew the president from our days as governor. I called him one time when the Steelers were playing the Cowboys for the Super Bowl. And I said to him, I don't want Pennsylvania Iron City beer for Texas beef. I want a manly wager. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, Mr. President, if the Steelers win, I get your legislature and you get mine. You don't understand that. Mine in Pennsylvania meets all year long, every year. His meets every 90 days, every 2 years. I want his instead of mine. Well, it didn't work out. By the way, the Steelers won. So he called me, and he said, we just had a power failure. What happened? Well, Mr. President, could you give me an hour and I'll get back to you? We had set up in the early days of the department both a protocol procedure whereby if something like this incident occurred, and we didn't know the magnitude of the incident, I think maybe you remember it, it's August of '03. A tree limb falls, I think, north of Cleveland, knocks down a power line. There were some bad decisions made along the way, but Canada was hit, Cleveland on, and like 55 million people affected. And what we said is we had key people from every agency that we thought would be required in an event of a national emergency. Get as much information as you can, so within an hour I can get back to the president and brief him and keep going on. Now that was a tree limb and a couple of bad decisions with regard to redirecting energy, and 55 million people were without electricity for at least 2 days. Now what you don't know, and what they don't know at DHS, even way back in the nascent days when we're trying to deal with Congress, we're trying to build the department, when we used to red cell physical attacks, occasionally we would throw in, even in '03 and '04, a simultaneous digital attack. And you have no reason to know this, but these energy companies and the grid get hit thousands of times a day. And frankly, the energy companies are doing a pretty good job. I mean, getting hit is a little bit different than exfiltrating information. But the enemies, and these are nation states more often than not, they only have to they can ping you 1,000 or 10,000 times. All they have to do is find one point of entry and then lie in wait. And so that's why, while there's a lot of public response and public attention to how do we respond and recover, I think we should be paying as much attention on the front end as well. And start with educational awareness. It's phishing. It's negligent use of passwords. It's third-party access. It's limiting access to certain components of your network to just people who have a need to know. There's certain basic fundamental things that a lot of people and a lot of companies still aren't doing.
No, absolutely. And speaking of energy companies, you sit on a board for Exelon, and that's one of just a few boards you're working on with private industry right now. Excuse me.
Well, I mean, it's the largest nuclear fleet, in the country, and they're on top of it. I mean, they spend. And that's one thing the public-private sector doesn't get credit for. They spend billions of dollars on cybersecurity, in spite of what some people may think. I'm not saying it's all well spent. A dollar amount doesn't necessarily relate to effectiveness, but I know what Exelon does, and all the other companies are doing it as well.
Do you believe
that's the other challenge? One more.
Sure.
It's the interdependency, though, of our economy. I mean, you can't view the electric grid in isolation from everything else, because if it goes down, everything else goes down. And look what just the tree limb in Cleveland. I hope you weren't in an elevator in New York City. God forbid you were on the operating table in a hospital. So we just have to think a little bit more completely about the impact of a cyber attack as it affects our critical infrastructure. Imagine shutting down overnight payment system and Fed, what it does to the economy. So anyhow, I'm preaching to the choir, but I haven't heard any amens yet. So
there you go.
Thank you,
we
brother.
got a couple. Well, you mentioned the investment that private industry is making right now, especially the companies like Exelon, energy companies, banks, and what have you. From your perspective of sitting on those boards right now, do you think that government's taking, some of the government agencies are taking advantage of those investments in the right ways, and making it easy for some of the breakthroughs that are happening in private industry be utilized from a government perspective to protect against? I mean, you mentioned how many times energy companies get attacked. I mean, how many times does Department of Homeland Security get attacked every day? I mean, it's in the millions, right? So, I mean, that's my question to you. Do you think that the government's doing a good enough job yet to take advantage of those breakthroughs?
Well, I've always been a big believer, I suspect everybody in the audience is, of public-private partnership. I mean, and if I had my way, I would figure out a way to get some of the brightest technical minds that are in the private sector now to become $1-a-year people and work with the federal government to help build out a far more robust national approach towards cybersecurity. It's a tremendous burden to think that DHS, no matter how well-intentioned those people are, can really affect the kind of national change that you want, because their reach is still limited. The number of employees is limited. The skill sets are good, but they're not as broad or as deep as the private sector. And I'd like to see down the road a much more robust and visible engagement and use of the private sector at the federal level to try to build out these systems. Roosevelt was able to get from the major industrial companies when we got involved in World War II, a lot of people to come to Washington for $1 a year or whatever. And they helped lead and direct and organize our response to that threat. I think this is that level, although we haven't declared a war. And I don't know who it would be, and there's millions of people out there that are a lot smarter than I am when it comes to the technical side of this challenge. But I do think that building a national strategy and bringing in some of the best capabilities within the private sector is probably the best way to deal with this permanent condition that will only get more intense. The digital sun will never set. It's just going to get hotter. And so we have to think a little bit differently now than perhaps we have at earlier times, given the nature of earlier threats, because we are all connected.
Okay. So you mentioned a little bit about getting people to work, with the government and getting some of the top tech talent there. what are some more ways that some of these different agencies can do to recruit? We're not just talking, CEOs and whatnot to do national strategies, but even somewhat in the lower level to get some of the programmers, developers, some of the folks that are sitting out in the crowd right now who work with organizations. We're going to have the U.S. Digital Service speak after you. So that's a good example of where we've seen some of those initiatives to bring some of these folks into government. Can more be, do you feel that more needs to be done within that area? Sir?
Well, because I spent a lot of my life in public service and I speak and have dealt with a lot of men and women who've done the same thing, most people work for government. They've got a passion. The part of their DNA is about service. It just is. And you don't necessarily do it because you expect to become wealthy. You do it because you have a sense of service. You feel good about working for government. I don't care at the local level, the federal level. It's in the DNA. Some people just have that. I do think in certain positions we have to think about salary, pay. I mean, the attractiveness my God, who'd you rather work for, DHS or Facebook? Now, I personally don't have a Facebook account. It'd be a cold day before I ever get one. It's just generational for me and how, I thought it was an interesting question. Cambridge Analytica got all that, so I'm not sure they're necessarily the guys who bring in to tell us how to create a secure infrastructure. But having said that, there are technical people out there with great minds and great capabilities, and there's a lot of technical people in the federal government have that, so that allures there. So I don't know if we can figure out how do we do a pay structure variable, even if it's regional. Might make a difference, like we do with some of the TSA folks. A regional difference might help keep people. You want to attract the best, but you also want to keep them. I'm a big believer, we have such a technologically oriented military. I'd like to figure out a way to transition some of these incredible men and women into that space. And, I think we have to be very creative in terms of how we can embed some of the private sector people with private sector pay into these operations to help us build out. And we have to get around this mindset, because if I bring somebody in from Apple or Facebook or Microsoft or Amazon or this or that somehow once they're inside the government, their sole purpose will be to advance their own corporate agenda. I don't believe that. And I believe you can make sure that doesn't happen. So I think and we also have to, again, I think we have to be very creative in how we can blend, attract, retain, maybe the military, maybe pay differential, and then let's figure out a way to embed some of the brightest minds in the private sector, keep them on that private sector payroll to work hand in glove inside the federal government.
Okay. I think we only have a couple more minutes left, but I wanted to save some time for questions from the audience for Governor Ridge. If you could hold up your hand, we have a couple of microphones. So does anyone have any questions for the governor while we have him here? Right here in the second row.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the idea of deterring some of that activity against both the government and the private sector. There's a question of whether cyber deterrence is even kind of a functional concept, whether having cyber weapons that could be used does convince an adversary not to try to get into a network or attack, or whether deterrence really should only remain in the sort of kinetic sphere. Do you believe that deterrence can prevent those adversaries from getting into networks, or are they going to get in no matter what, and the goal is just to mitigate what they get?
Did you hear the question was about cyber? Do I believe in the concept of cyber deterrence? I do. More importantly, I don't think the burden should be on the private sector to develop and use those tools. I, for one, once we discovered that North Korea had hacked into Sony for the second time, I wish when Kim Jong-un had opened either his laptop or his iPad one morning, he had the American flag waving in front of him and the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, playing behind him, basically saying, look, dude, we know what you're up to. We can get into your network, and the next time you do this, there'll be serious retaliation. I think you have to be selective. I have to be strategic. I don't mean to demean that. But I do think that those who would do us harm digitally have to understand, appreciate we do have the same capability. And it's like, so I'm a proponent of the deterrent, selectively used. And frankly, while it's a world of great transparency, this is not something I think necessarily that the general public ought to know that we're using.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question here, right here in the front. Quintus.
Hi, good morning, Governor.
Morning.
Thank you very much. That digital. So thank you very much. I just tweeted out the digital sun will never set; it'll only just get hotter. So you'll see that on Twitter here in a little bit. Whether it's a nation-state actor or a hacktivist or even just a criminal enterprise, ultimately what the bad guys want is data. And a couple of the sectors, not necessarily finance or telecom, but healthcare has a lot of rich data with personal information, personal health information, publicly, PII, PHI. Yeah. So what do you think can be done in terms of DHS working with some of the health-focused agencies, FDA to secure devices or CMS to secure, Medicaid, Medicare data to make sure that the nation-state actors don't get a new entry point, or at least we can minimize and mitigate their threat, protecting the data?
Well, I have a slightly different twist in response to your question. I think the most important thing, again, you can give to any healthcare provider is any information that you have, a precursor, some malware, just put it out there in the system. I think you can encourage and support and accelerate the ISAC for the healthcare industry. It's kind of lagging behind the last time I checked. And it's still up to the CEOs and the boards of directors and everyone to understand that they have it. I know people don't understand that information has value on the black market. It's enormously valuable. I'm going to file a false insurance return. I'm going to file for a false Medicare or Medicaid claim. And it's going on all the time. So I think probably the most important thing DHS can do is engage them probably more rhetorically to encourage, to oversee. We started NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, a couple years came out with just a basic, I think it's really basic outline of the kinds of things that companies across the board should do as they try to pay attention to the first three to the identify the threat, detect it, and prevent it, those three cases. But I still think if you wait for the government in any capacity to help you shore up your defenses, I think it's a mistake. I think the best thing they can do is accelerate information, help you accelerate your growth of the ISAC, and to the extent that they're the smaller healthcare companies need some guidance, I'm sure that they're willing to do it. But I don't think the government, and I don't think any industry or any company should be looking to the federal government to help them figure out what they need to do. It's as clear as the nose on your face. There are certain precautionary measures, and you ought to start with educational awareness, digital hygiene, and this notion of just having a firewall, forget it. You have to layer in multiple defenses. And after that, I would say, ladies and gentlemen, it's a risk you are managing because you can't eliminate it. But also understand that it's a dynamic environment. So don't be satisfied today that you're done for the rest of the year. Based on new information or anything else that you may learn in that sector, you may have to do something different with your infrastructure and your network. So I don't want to demean the role of the government. I think there's a role. They use the CERT at Carnegie Mellon. NIST is doing some things. But right now, the government seems to be primarily interested in penalizing people for not doing what they think is appropriate. I prefer the exhortation, and let's try to work with these sectors to make sure that they're doing these basic, but I think very, very important preventive measures. We spend too much time on reaction, not enough time on prevention.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Governor Ridge, for joining us.
Thanks all very much.
This morning. I appreciate your comments. great to have that perspective. So, thank you very much. So could I have our reporter, Amanda Zieta, front here, and then she is going to introduce our next panel. But thank you again, Governor Ridge. Thank you for the time.
Take care, Seth.
Oh, thank you. We should.
Thank you. All right. Hello. Good morning. Please feel free to come and fill in some of the empty spots in the front if you'd like a seat. All right. So at this time, I'd love to invite my panelists to the stage, but the stairs are over here. I'm just standing on this side. My name is Amanda Zieta. I'm a reporter with Government CIO Media and the host of GovCast, which if you haven't heard it yet, it is our podcast on iTunes. All right. So directly to my right, we have Nick Sinai, venture partner at Insight Venture Partners and former deputy CTO of the U.S. Then next to Nick, we have Stephanie Neal, executive director of the USDS at DHS. Next to Stephanie is Marcy Jacobs, executive director of USDS at VA. And next to Marcy is Alex Romero, digital service expert at the U.S. Defense Digital Service. So before we start, I just wanted to give a quick congratulations to Marcy. Earlier this week, she won a Sammy's Award for the work that her and her team are doing at the VA.gov. I had to put you on spot. Okay. So first, I want to start by asking each of our panelists what they're doing at their respective agencies at USDS. Stephanie, we'll start with you. You've been at USDS DHS for 2.5 years working on a number of projects, if you want to talk about those.
Sure. So as I think you all know, Homeland Security serves a variety of populations. So we, as the digital service, come in and partner on the program level to deliver services to some of those populations. We've actually been working with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to modernize and digitize the immigration benefits process since 2014. When we first started working with them, they had about 10% online, and as of last fall, they now are up to 50% of the workload being available online, which is obviously improving efficiencies and just making processing benefits and delivering benefits more effective. Also within USCIS, we are working on a department priority to help reduce the backlog for asylum seekers. So as you guys know, or may know, it can take up to 4 years for an asylum seeker who arrives in the States today in order to get a decision. So we're working to reduce that from both an experience perspective as well as a security one. And last but not least, we are working with FEMA. Earlier this year, we partnered with the Grants Management Modernization Program to help them essentially modernize their 10+ legacy systems into a single platform to deliver the $10 billion+ a year that it does to individuals and institutes to help recover and rebuild from disasters.
Marcy, you've been working on the brand consolidation of vets.gov and va.gov, right?
Yes. So VA has hundreds of different websites, probably about 5 or 6 that are the primary sites, vets.gov being one of those. And there are 10 million people who come to different VA online properties every month. It is a very disjointed and fractured experience. We built vets.gov to start pulling together plain language content, easy to use transactions, and make that a single front door so that veterans can easily understand and find out what they have earned, what they have access to. Right now, it's very much aligned by our administrations, which if you understand, you know how to navigate, but most people do not understand. And when they come to VA, they just want to come to VA. They don't want to understand that there's benefit side and a health side and other sides. So what vets.gov has been doing is migrating some of that functionality onto a stable, modern cloud platform, working with users to make sure that we're building tools in a way that they can actually use those tools. Some of our tools were you had to downgrade your PDF viewer so that you could fill out a form. Who's going to do that? What we're doing now is sort of the next evolution of vets.gov, which is really putting the content where people are looking in the primary place that our users go, which we've learned through a lot of research with over 5,000 different veterans, service members, caregivers, VSOs, is they go to va.gov. So we're using va.gov as the platform and really putting that best content there. The other thing that my team has been working on is really building the internal tools to improve the experience for the people who receive that information once somebody hits submit. We have a team that's focused on building tools for attorneys and judges at the Board of Veterans Appeals and streamlining that process. It still takes a while, 5 to 10 years for your appeals to be processed, but we're improving that and we're building transparency so that at least we set a realistic expectation for veterans that it's not going to happen in 3 months. It's going to happen over a long period of time, and updating people as to what is the current status.
Yeah, go ahead. And we talked earlier, you said you actually met USDS through the Hack the Pentagon pilot, right?
That's right, yeah. So I was actually the Chief Information Security Officer at the Defense Media Activity and ran a lot of the top sites for the DoD. And the Defense Digital Service came to us before in their formative stages as they were kind of standing up. And didn't know about them. They came to us asking to start a bounty against, defense.gov, which was the top site, or the flagship site for the DoD. Didn't know who those guys were, so I kind of asked for a letter from their boss initially. The boss ended up being the SecDef. So I got a letter from the SecDef saying basically shut up in color, so that's what I did. Years later, I actually joined forces with them, and we're trying to improve security, along with just improving services throughout the DoD for the service members and their families. So we've got a bunch of projects like Move.mil, try to facilitate folks as they're moving around the military. Code.mil to try to open source more of the code within the department. And also what I'm currently working on is the Hack the Pentagon program itself. As a technical SME, trying to figure out what are good options to test in a bounty crowdsourced security way. So we just finished with the Hack the Marines. We had a Medium post go live yesterday, but it was wildly successful. It was an on-site sort of assessment of a lot of Marine Corps assets. And during the event itself, it was the last day of DEF CON in Black Hat. We actually found all sorts of vulnerabilities, but the Marine Corps is pretty good at actually getting them patched. But I don't think they would have found a lot of those vulnerabilities had it not been for this crowdsourced security model. I don't want to take up too much of our time, sorry.
That's perfect.
I can keep going.
Yeah, we'll get there. And Nick, USDS came out of the CTO shop. You've worked with USDSers, continue to work with them, and now you invest in cutting-edge cybersecurity companies. What's the intersection of digital transformation there?
Thanks for having me. Well, the U.S. Digital Services is fundamentally about understanding the user need, the citizen need, the immigrant need, the veteran need, the service member need, and helping build and buy the right services and deliver things that are simply intuitive and work across all channels, but with a focus on digital, right? And so part of that is buying modern commercial software. And so I'm pleased as part of Insight to be investing in those kinds of companies. But I actually wanted to pick up on something that Governor Ridge was talking about. He said, we need to have these $1-a-year employees. And what I'm not sure that he recognizes, we already have them, right? The U.S. Digital Service largely recruits from the private sector to come in for 6 months, a year, 2 years. The head of the U.S. Digital Service spent almost 20 years at Google. I didn't even realize that Google was 20 years old. But he led the web spam team. We had the security princess, Brissa, from Google come in and help. Matthew Weaver, he helped stand up the U.S. Digital Service. He helped respond to the OPM breach and in fact used Cylance as one of the commercial tools and others to help fix and recover from that breach. So there's a long history of bringing in great experts to work with really passionate public servants. And I think that's the other thing that gets lost sometimes is that the U.S. Digital Service would not be effective if they didn't have great champions and great public servants that they partner with every day that sometimes don't get to sit up on stage.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to ask a bit of a broader question now. Why are these solutions and tools needed right now in government? What are they driven by? Whoever would like to start, feel free.
So I think generally speaking, it's obviously the responsibility of the government to deliver these services in the most effective and efficient way that they can. But I think, obviously technology is simply a new tool that needs to be brought in to help realize these efficiencies and these gains. So, things like moving to the cloud can actually make these more secure, and, time to remediation is drastically reduced. So I think it's really just leveraging, new trends to support what, we as public servants have been trying to do for hundreds of years, deliver services to the people.
Software eats world, right? And so that's kind of an investment thesis of a number of investors. But software is also eating government, right? And so how do we build better software, and how do we buy better software that actually meets the needs and lets us deliver the services that we are promising as a government?
I think it's interesting when you hear about how much money the government spends on IT. I think it's $87 billion a year, some crazy amount of money. And the statistic that I heard was that 40% of that is never deployed because of whatever reason. There are so many small things that we can do to improve those metrics to make sure that we're actually getting the value. $87 billion, and do you all think that government IT is like the cutting edge, the best thing ever? We're spending a lot of money and we are not getting the value of that investment because we're going about it in ways that are not modern, that are not the private sector ways of developing software. And I think a lot of that comes down to thinking about technology, not from a technology first perspective, but from what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? What is the human behavior we are trying to change or we are trying to support? And how do we work from that outcome back to that investment? The way procurement is set up, the way, honestly, congressional funding is set up, we reinforce this dichotomy of we're going to throw money at problems and buy technology or throw solutions over the wall at a contractor and think that that's going to lead to a different outcome. I think what the digital service brings is a very different perspective and tries to show that by doing small things. Start small, show a win, learn something from it, and iterate.
Anything to add? Or?
Pretty much covers it.
Awesome.
I think profit motives help private industry to actually iterate and get to a place. Whereas within government, it's a little bit different, right? You're just maybe things move a little bit slower. So we have to bring those best ideas of how they do business, essentially.
And so I'm sure consumer expectations drive those capabilities a little bit.
Can I just add a point on technology? Technology is not a panacea, and I say that as someone, we have dozens and dozens of portfolio companies that are technology companies that deliver cutting-edge solutions, but it's not a panacea. It's also people and process and systems and all of those kinds of things with the user need as the North Star of like what are we actually trying to do as an outcome. I think that we probably spend too much money on services and people rather than on technology. And when we do buy technology, we often don't buy the right technology. So there is an opportunity to say, hey, what is working in the commercial sector? And the commercial sector is not a panacea ever. Also, I mean, they make plenty of mistakes too. But see, hey, what is working at scale? And let's bring some of those best practices. And let's also bring those processes. So when we think about user-centered design or human-centered design is actually understanding what a veteran is trying to do and see it from their perspective. So it's not this forcing the veteran to navigate a large bureaucracy, but it's saying, hey, we're going to come to you and hide the complexity. We're going to do the hard work to hide the complexity and make it easy for you to get your benefits that you so deserve.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into my next question about human-centered design and product management. How are those methods used in the projects that you're deploying in your agencies?
So everything that we do starts with user research, and that can mean a lot of different things. If there is an existing tool that we are trying to improve upon, we do a lot of testing to understand what's working and what's not working. And research can be everything from one-on-one sessions, sitting next to a veteran, asking them questions, watching their behavior. It can be online, unmoderated surveys. We just released some surveys where we were testing language and making sure that navigation structures made sense to people. We've tested that with 1,700 people and iterated every round. We look at a ton of data to see what are people calling the help desk about? What are people confused about or really angry about that maybe we're not explaining in the right way? Apparently, updating your contact information is the second most called about thing across our over 1,000 call centers. Not kidding, over 1,000. And people call millions of times to update their contact information. What you don't know about the VA is previously, if you updated your contact information in one of the 87 databases that held your contact information, you uploaded your contact information in one of the 87 places, and that was it. Not a great experience. So people would call, people would be angry. We've been partnering with the Veteran Experience Office, who has built this platform called Vet 360, where they're trying to really pull together all of this data that lives in all these different silos across the agency, across all these different businesses, and everybody owns their data, which is not the right way that we need to be operating. And now if you update your contact information, which a veteran can do self-service without having to call somebody, on vets.gov, it propagates to all the other systems, which is so not revolutionary. It's so duh. But it's amazing. 40,000 people a day are updating their contact information and not having to call somebody. That's huge. That means that people are actually getting a letter saying when their hearing that they might have been waiting 5 years for, when their hearing is scheduled, as opposed to missing their hearing, which a third of people do. So it's little things like that. It's just listening to all the different channels and saying, what's really broken? What's a thing that we could fix? What's a pain point that we could have some impact on? We're not going to solve everything at once, but what's a step that we can take?
Well, real quick, you had teams from USDS sit with veterans at medical centers and watch how they used the site and the system, which I think is an amazing way to test how people are using it and take that feedback.
Yeah, we try to do a lot of in-person. It's very hard to kind of hijack someone while they're going into a doctor's appointment and say, can you just look at this for 10 minutes? But it typically is something where we need 10 minutes of people's time. And some of the testing that we do, it's really hard to recruit someone who already has a service connection and wants to submit a claim for an increase for a disability. That, like, the nuance is so complicated to test some of the tools that we're building. But we do a lot of partnering. There are a lot of veterans that actually work at the VA. So we do a lot of partnering internally as well to kind of tap into that market. That said, if anybody's interested in volunteering for user testing and is a veteran, please see me afterwards. But yeah, we try to do as much in person as we can, because then you can have the richness of the conversation to ask, why did you choose that, as opposed to just seeing a survey where you don't get that follow-up.
Stephanie?
Oh yeah, and I just want to call out that conducting user-centered design techniques and practices like user research and usability testing is really key to risk reduction. And I think that feels counterintuitive. A lot of programs, become focused on deadline, and they think, we want to get the software out as quickly as possible. And just adding in user research and usability testing throughout the process can just, bloat the timeline. But what it leads to is producing higher quality products that will ultimately be viable in the marketplace, or for the users in the end, and that saves you a lot of time ultimately.
I totally want to just draw a line under that, because I think user research is still seen as this optional thing. If we have time, or if it's something new, it is the thing that helps you build the right solution. So if you aren't spending money and aren't investing in user research, you can be doing agile software delivery, you can be doing a modern process and building really quickly in the wrong direction.
So just stop and think about, what is government service delivery? There's software in it, whether you're delivering services to veterans or helping process immigrants, or a weapons system. There's fundamentally software in there. And what's the traditional way that we build software? Well, we write requirements for years, we do procurement for years, we build for years, and then in year 10, we say, here's some software. And the user, the operator, the beneficiary looks at it and is like, that wasn't what I needed. And so we've just, the technology may be more obsolete, the needs may have changed, the program may have shifted. And so I just want to +1 to this conversation about the way we traditionally do programs, and how software is actually part of the DNA of government. The other piece of this is, well, so who sits over all of that? project managers, right? What is one of the disciplines that you have in government is project managers who kind of oversee that big, let's write requirements and let's do procurement, right, and so forth. But what we really need is more of a discipline around product management. And that's why it's so cool to have folks like Stephanie, who that's her core discipline in the private sector is product management, right? And thinking about these things from products. And you don't spend 10 years building a product in the private sector. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but you didn't do it that way and then be like, aha, here you go, right?
We would be not only late to market, but obsolete, I'm sure, by the time we got out.
Yeah, so it's just this emerging discipline of product management, which is one of the hottest areas in business schools. I actually teach it in my class at the Harvard Kennedy School. I think product management is this discipline that we need to have more of in government, and that really encompasses and is related to these ideas of human-centered design and this user research and usability testing when we have prototypes and products, but also on the technical side, agile software development, so that we're have small teams that are building smaller pieces of software rather than kind of this big bang of software. And to tie it all back to the security conversation that we're having here today, that means how do you use modern stacks? How do you move in the cloud? How do you shift left with security and actually build secure code and test it, so you don't say, oh, we've been building for 2 years, now let's start running a bunch of tests to see how vulnerable this particular application is if you're building it internally.
And speaking of security, why is incentivizing bounties an important part in integrating security from the ground up in solutions in government, especially at DDS?
Yeah, so I think what we've learned with the bounties is that incentivizing researchers to come in and test our systems is really helpful. I mean, I was thinking about this last night. In the Wild West, you didn't just have bounty hunters going out for free to find the bad guys. They actually were incentivized by some sort of bounty on their head. And in the same way, if we put, money behind a bug that is found that's brought to us, then I think we get some really good results. But there's also a disclosure policy part of this as well, where if you don't have a way to just get free assistance, a lot of times researchers are just willing to give you, some tips on maybe an open port that shouldn't be open or an application that has a bug in it. So we actually launched the vulnerability disclosure policy right after the first pilot for Hack the Pentagon. And since then, we've gotten over, I think, 7,500 or so vulnerabilities reported to us throughout the entire DoD sort of application, all the applications that are out there for DoD, which are substantial. It's a huge attack surface. So having the help from outside researchers has just been tremendous, because we've been able to identify, prioritize, and put resources towards actually fixing the worst of those items. So.
Do you think that's something every agency should adopt, vulnerability disclosure policy?
Absolutely. If you can't receive free help, I heard this quote the other day, then I don't know, what else can you do? That should be the bare minimum, is the ability to actually receive free assistance from researchers. That, and being on the other side, I like to work with the hacker community quite a bit, and folks got to know me over time, and then they would just start reporting things to me because there was no other obvious way to report vulnerabilities. And so it really hit close to home when certain vulnerabilities were in my systems, but there was no legal sort of route that they could take because of CFA and DMCA. They just didn't feel comfortable reporting it and just sending an email or doing full disclosure sort of thing, or direct disclosure to me. So having a mechanism and a path for researchers to bring in information to us is incredibly important. So I recommend it to any agency that's out there. And we actually consult with other organizations if they want to start their own bounty or start their own disclosure policy. We have a lot of lessons learned, things that have worked, things that haven't. So.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
I think that it's sometimes scary for agencies, because they're like, what do I do with this information? What if I don't have development dollars? What if we just don't look at it and then maybe it won't be a problem? How do you handle that argument? Because there are a lot of agencies who are like, we don't want to put ourselves out there and say, tell us what's wrong. We'd rather just kind of stick our head in the sand and hope that nobody notices.
If a tree falls in the forest, does a vulnerability exist, right? This sound was made, there's a vulnerability. Whether or not you know about it and you see it is kind of, it's not important. It is there, so deal with it. And what's kind of interesting is for each one of these bounties, that has been a concern, absolutely. well, we're not sure if we have the remediation monies to actually fix the issue, to mitigate it. But always there's been magical funds that appear. Just the cyber money and unicorn cyber money just appears to fix things most of the time, right? If it's bad enough and it's highlighted, it will eventually be fixed. So I think it's a good way to actually put some extra attention on those things that you are not sure about or you think could be done better, or there are indications that it's been compromised already, which there's been a lot of that. So.
Is that a new congressional budget submission strategy for my program?
Run a bounty, get some money. I don't know.
So I wanted to ask a quick closing question before we go to Q&A. We're running out of time a little bit. I want to know how you advise other agencies to adopt these digital solution best practices, especially when they don't have folks like you all on their team.
Sure, so I can start. I think this is probably pretty obvious, but I would say check out the Digital Service Playbook. It's online, and I know of a lot of programs that we don't personally work with that will refer to it and try to implement throughout their product development process. And actually, I believe you co-wrote that, right?
A little bit. There's a lot of authors, but yeah.
I'd say also check out U.S. Digital Service values. So we use our values to help us scale across all these different agencies, and ultimately they help help us to build better software by following things like create momentum, design with users, not for users, and the like. And I'd also say consider the fact, I think to Marcy's earlier point, it's not technology first, it's figure out the problem first. What is the problem you're actually trying to solve?
I would just say start small. Don't feel like you need to write every requirement for 2 years and then procure a solution for 2 years and then build a thing. Just start really small. Figure out what is the most broken part of the problem or what is something that is solvable, and build some momentum with that and learn from that and be iterative. I would also say don't wait till the end to do things like, is this usable? Is this secure? It has to be baked in the whole way through because you can't really do much to change it when you're at the end. So small, digestible bites.
Yeah. I was going to just say really quickly, just do it, right? So just empower yourself. And a lot of times you'll find that you have the support of leadership if they see that you're actually making positive change. As a young Marine, I found some issues in weapon systems that I was working on, and I brought it to my leadership. They didn't know what to do with it at the time, but I was empowered to actually attempt to fix it on my own if I could. But later on in my career, I just started taking that premise and applying it. If I could fix it, why not? Just try.
Yeah, we have fantastic public servants who, if empowered and also matched with the right kind of air cover and leadership, can do so much. And so to the folks who are inside agencies, I would echo all the comments here. To the leaders who attend, I would say give that kind of air cover to try these things, because you'll see they actually reduce risk and improve service delivery rather than kind of what you might be thinking. And then I'm also a big fan of people flow strategies, right? So you don't have to have a digital service team, but you can also think about how do you bring people in on short-term tours of duty or from other agencies or other disciplines.
Do we have time for Q&A? No. No time for Q&A. Well, thank you all so much. Sorry to take all the time with my questions. Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much to everybody with the U.S. Digital Service, and thank you, Nick, for joining us as well. I'd like to introduce Dylan Connor, the CTO from ID Technologies, to join me on stage. I'll get you a microphone as well. All right, so we have Dylan here joining us from ID Technologies, and what we hope for is for Dylan to use his 18 years of federal government experience to give us a little bit of an industry perspective. We've been lucky enough to have quite a few government leaders here join us and talk about some of the challenges they have and some of the opportunities they do in IT modernization and cybersecurity. But what we're hoping to is, based on the experience that Dylan has here, is to talk a little bit about some of the what he's seen from the industry perspective, from working from the outside of government and seeing what we have going on there. So Dylan actually challenged me too. He said he wanted this to be a challenging the status quo. He didn't want the typical softballs thrown out there, so we're gonna do a few of those here. I also wanted
Careful
to mention,
what I wish for, right?
Absolutely. I also wanted to mention Dylan is a lifelong Texas Longhorns fan. So congratulations to your team. You had a bit of a hiccup against my alma mater in the beginning, but we'll take that. Moving along. Hit a sore spot there. So the federal CIO, Suzette Kent, testified before Congress that the technology talent gap is one of the greatest challenges facing government. What does the government need to do to avoid brain drain?
Wow, so we start off with some trash talk about my football team and then go straight to the top. I can appreciate that. Well, so I think that the technology, I think that the brain drain conversation, I think that it's a multifaceted problem for government. I think you see issues in direct hiring authorities. I think you see issues in a lot of different arenas. But sitting on the other side and being the fortunate recipient, a lot of the talent that our taxpayers paid to develop, the number one reason I see people leaving is frustration. They didn't have the expectation. They didn't have their expectations set properly when they got in. They expected to be part of cooler things. But mostly it's just the process. It's just the fact that it's the biggest bureaucracy in the world, and some people can't cut through that. But the comments from the panel members before me and Governor Rich before them really give me a lot of hope. You hear terms like agile and iterative and start small, get big, find success where you can. That's what the private industry does. That's how we address that. So I think from the people side, I think that it's going to be key to hone in on processes that are as close to private industry, not necessarily product development from let's sell a product, but what the private industry is doing internally. So if you look at what Google does internally or what Facebook does internally to support their mission, it is not necessarily the product they're selling you, right, or me as a user. Their internal processes are very well developed. Failure is always an option. There is no CYA. CYA is not tolerated. And I think that creating a culture where the definitions of success are not meeting a deadline, they're not necessarily related to these kind of intangible factors that are built into a process beforehand. I think the other side of that problem for brain drain is knowledge management. And I think that what really happens in these organizations is you'll find a nexus of 3 or 4 or sometimes 50 people that know where all the people are, all the systems are, all the data is. And when they go to private sector, a lot of times they get picked up by the agency as a contractor because, well, you can't afford to lose that person, or that's the perception. So I think that knowledge management kind of hit a high point mid-2000s. It was really exciting. I think that the development, then it trailed off. But I think the development of AI and machine learning and the ability to interact with systems in a way that's more natural for an organization to be able to go to its systems and interrogate them with a question like, hey, how am I adhering to the risk management framework in this program, and be able to get a meaningful answer? Those types of capabilities are real, and I think that that's another way that government agencies can start to address this problem.
ID Technologies does a lot of great work with national security and some of the classified programs out there. Does commercial solutions for classified do enough to leverage industry innovation to deliver IA solutions quickly enough to government? So
I think that the NSA CSFC program office is one of the most innovative approaches to cyber I've seen in a long time. They essentially said, hey, industry, here's a set of ways you can put together stuff you're already doing in a way that makes it suitable for classified information over untrusted networks or environments. Really, the failure has been on industry. We haven't done enough from an industry perspective to productize this. We haven't done enough to automate this and make it easier to consume. I think that industry in general is kind of sitting back and taking I'll call it an older school approach, where they're waiting for an RFI or an RFP, and they want to put 50 or 100 people on a program to develop a capability, instead of saying, hey, the government has already identified requirements. They've already told us this is what they need. Why aren't we building this?
So earlier today, DHS Undersecretary Krebs talked a little bit about risk management and the work that they're doing right there to kind of change the discussion there. What can the government agencies do to take more responsibility but less risk? So I think that's a great question, right? And it's one that has a lot of answers, and I'm probably going to put my foot wrong here, so if I offend anybody, I apologize. But I think it has to do with redefining risk and responsibility. When I see RFPs and RFIs coming out from the government, especially along
systems that should be incredibly standardized, incredibly simple, really boring systems, really, that's the word I like to use. It's not sexy. The government is still hesitant to take on requirements in terms of framework or approach. They want to leave the requirements as open as possible, so in case there's a failure, it is the vendor or the integrator's responsibility to address that issue. But the net result of that is the fact that the government gets something that's not adhering to any standards, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, who's left holding the bag, right? You don't see industry stepping up to say, you know what, you're right, I'm going to give you all your money back. We didn't do that right. Here's your money back for the program that we didn't deliver. I can tell you, I've been part of both sides of those programs. And the ones that worked had strong government leadership with IT people that understood both the technology and the implication of the technology for the government. And the ones that didn't had people that were concerned with covering their assets, so to speak, and making sure that any failure was directed anywhere but that program. And that type of approach never works in IT. There's never a way to blame your way out of a problem. There's never a way to buy your way out of a problem. And I think one of the gentlemen on the panel before mentioned unicorn cyber money, and I know it does come, and I know it's critical, and it helps agencies address issues that otherwise they don't have the funding to address, but it has to be delivered in the right way. When you come to a program that wasn't expecting money and say, hey, here's $50 million to address your cyber problem, what do? They call the guy they know that knows cybersecurity, and they say, hey, man, I got $50 million, or hey, lady, I got $50 million, what should I do? And they say, well, you should buy this new IDS IDVP product. I've got some really cool malware prevention stuff that does zero-day detection and exploitation, and just send me a PO and that'll fix your problem. And so that unicorn cyber money does not get deployed in a way that's actually meaningful for the government. I was part of an exploit, and I'm not going to say who it was, but I was part of the remediation for an exploit at a major agency about 10 years ago, and the response was buy all new desktops. Right? We've been exploited. We should buy all new desktops. And it's like, that's not the answer. Right? And they got money from Congress to do that. And they bought 80,000 new desktops and deployed them over the next year. And at the end of it, they hadn't done one thing to put a better foot forward from a cyber posture. And configuration management is really important, right? It's one of those things that was mentioned earlier as one of the basic things you have to do, but you can't buy your way out of a configuration management problem. And so when you talk about responsibility and risk, I think unfortunately, as thankless as the job can be, and thank you for your service, civilian or DoD, as thankless as it could be, you do have to be willing to take on responsibility and say, I own the outcome for every IT project that I put out there. And when you do that, and you focus on retaining talent, and you have people on the programs that understand what you're trying to do in your mission, you're going to have a better outcome. And I think that industry, all of us, including my company, which I think we do a good job, needs to be less reactive to this unicorn funding and more proactive in putting even unsolicited proposals in front of the government. If you get money, here's what you should do, and it should have an outcome that looks like this. And if it doesn't, we failed. So I think that's the approach that industry needs to take in partnership with government. Of the $87 billion in government IT that goes out there, 40% of it doesn't get deployed. I guarantee you the lion's share of that 40% goes to industry. It's not being spent on people who work with the government. And so I think it's on us to have a better return on investment from our government partners.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have, but thank you very much, Dylan, for the time. And thank you for ID Technologies and the support in making today possible. So thank you very much. If I could have Daryl, Government CIO VP for Cybersecurity, join me up front. He'll be moderating the next panel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the final panel here at Government CIO on the state of mind for the CXOs that are responsible in some way for cybersecurity at their agencies. Joining me is going to be Eric Sanders, Chief Risk Management Division at NGA, Mark Hawken, Deputy CIO at NSA, Amy Hasseltine at HHS, Executive Director for Enterprise Services, and then Lisa Belt from DISA, Cybersecurity Development Executive. So thank you all for joining the panel. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to have each individual introduce themselves and talk about their role a little bit at their agency, and then we've got some specific initiatives and impact activities that they're working on specifically at their agency that they'll be able to talk about. And I think this is really good in the backdrop of the discussions that we've been having all day, whether Christopher Krebs or Tom Ridge or the USDS discussion. Basically there's a lot of strategy, whether it's the White House strategy, the DoD strategy, DHS has a strategy for cybersecurity. There are programmatic changes going on at agencies as they align to the cybersecurity framework and other initiatives that are driving risk-based decision-making. But there's also a lot of ongoing operational activities that are really the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity at each of these departments and agencies that have ultimate responsibility for protecting infrastructure of .gov and .mil. So I think it's important to hear more on the tactical side also of what's going on at the agencies from their perspectives and the initiatives that are making an impact at the agency to improve our cybersecurity posture. So with that, if we could go down the panel and just give a minute or two to introduce yourself, and then I'll come back around with a question for each of you.
Fantastic. Eric Sanders, good morning. My organization within NGA is responsible for assessing risk and making authorization decisions for all of the agency's IT. Obviously, how we define IT changes, and we're investing heavily in cloud and platform as a service and building out capabilities. And so one of our challenges is, how do we can't handle services and smaller capabilities that are designed to exist on our platform as a service environment like we do traditional IT. And so one of our biggest challenges has been and continues to be, how do we appropriately assess risk, do it smarter, do it faster, and enable mission in a more timely fashion.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mark Hawken. I am the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the National Security Agency. Our office is the nexus of oversight for all the IT, both business and mission IT management at the agency. It includes the Chief Information Security Officer and also the Chief Data Officer. When we're talking CXOs, it's the nexus of where all the CXOs are at the agency. Between all the security oversight over both and then the management of the data and the large-scale analytics that go ahead along with our mission space. I've been in this role about 6 months. Prior to that, I had the privilege of serving with Lisa at DISA for about a year, working in the National Background Investigation System development. And my background at NSA, with the 11 years I've been there, has been on the information assurance side. So I'm using this as an opportunity to learn what the other side of the agency actually does. So it's a good learning experience for me as well as quite a challenge.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Hazeltine. I serve as the Deputy CIO for Enterprise Services at the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a long title, but what it really means is that when it comes to technology, my organization and the purview of my particular position is to focus on strategy, policy, and governance as it relates to the IT portfolio of the department. I've been in this role for about a year and a half. I have come to it from a variety of different standpoints, really mostly on the management side. So served in the Chief Financial Officer role in that organization, served in grants and acquisitions, policy, and systems areas, as well as some of the activities that are in our behavioral health system at HHS. So this role is particularly exciting because it gives us a chance to really think about how technology can and should enable mission and how it should make our world and our business run in a more effective and efficient manner. So very, very appreciative to be in the panel this morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm Lisa Belt. I'm the Acting Director for Cyber Development at the Defense Information Systems Agency. My boss is Vice Admiral Nancy Norton. She's dual-hatted. She's not only the director of our agency, but she's also on the staff of US Cybercom. So she's got two bosses. On the Cybercom operational side, General Nakasone, and on the DoD DISA side, the DoD CIO, Mr. Dana Deasy. So my organization is responsible primarily for developing material solutions for enterprise-level defensive cyber operations capabilities, products and services. In that, we've got perimeter defenses, joint regional security stack, regional defenses, endpoint defenses to include mobility, and then some of the underpinning enablers, if you will. Partnered with NSA, DISA runs is the co-lead on DoD PKI, cross-domain solutions, and then some aspects of workforce development as well. And I'm hoping that some of this good experience and knowledge will rub off on me and float this way.
Thank you, Lisa. So, Eric, I'll start with you. There's been a good bit of dialogue today about risk management, making better, risk-based decisions from a cybersecurity perspective, being able to proactively look at indicators and feed that into the way you're looking at the risks for your specific agency mission. Can you explain to us, some of the automation and enablement that you're putting in place with at NGA to, kind of make that happen?
Absolutely. So automation, obviously, we're not there yet. We're not where we want to be today, but we're working to get there. So one of our challenges, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, is to get to smarter, faster authorization decisions. But to do that, we really had to kind of step back and look at, are we taking the right kinds of risks in the right kinds of places? It's never about getting to, zero risk, and we'll never get there. So it's about taking the right amount of risk, right? The right kinds of risks for a particular system and its operating environment and the data you're trying to protect and so on and so forth. So we constructed a framework that kind of right sizes, security control, compliance, security requirements with, the system, the environment's going to be operating in, its ability to, and its subscription to enterprise services. We're relying very heavily on enterprise services to satisfy a lot of our security requirements. So it takes a lot of things into account, and then, we only then levy and require a subset of security controls to be assessed as part of that authorization decision for that particular capability. So the framework, it's been something that we talked about iteration earlier. It's something that, we started off, we decided, we're going to go forward with this, and then as we learned, we improved it and matured it, and it's gotten to the point now where we're sharing it with other agencies, and it's being received very well. But to complement that, we had to fix our GRC tool. It was mentioned earlier about human-centered design, and one thing that was not really designed for our users, our customers, is the GRC tool we were forcing them to use. So that was part of the pain. It wasn't just, the implementation of all these security controls and all the requirements they had to meet in order to get an ATO, if you will. It was, the tool that they had to use to go about doing that was, to put it mildly, not consumer friendly. So we've invested a lot of time and energy in that, and I think now we've got a tool that we've rolled out very recently that really simplifies the process, makes it clearer, makes it easier to use, and so far the feedback's been great. But again, I mentioned, we're having to assess and authorize capabilities, which are based on code. And initially you try to handle those like you do all of your other IT systems, and you find that doesn't work. So we've integrated security into our DevOps pipeline where a lot of these capabilities are produced. And we've gotten to a point now where we can actually get a capability through and approve it in a few days to as much as a week or so. And we've chopped a lot of process out of, for all of the systems that go through our ATO process. But the capabilities that are going through the DevOps pipeline, we're able to get done very quickly. Now, 3 days sounds great, right? And it does happen once in a while, but it's still not good enough. We need to deploy these capabilities faster because they're supporting critical missions. So how do we get there? And the only way we're going to get there is if we can get to some kind of automated decision making, right? We need to take the human as much as we can out of the loop here wherever possible, where it's appropriate. So if we can get to some level of automation within our DevOps pipeline where it goes through a series of checks and it's all automated when the developer's ready, receives some score that says, yeah, you're good enough, you get to go in ops right away. Or you're not quite good enough and somebody does need to take a look at this and make a decision. Or you're not good enough at all and hey, go back to go and start over. So that's what we're working towards, and I believe we're going to get there. But we're going to need industry's help to get there as well. Okay. So
we'll cover that a little bit later. Thank you. Appreciate that, Eric. Lisa, you and I had discussed transformation initiatives at Department of Defense. You've got a top 10. You're looking at kind of a zero trust network policy. You've got a lot of responsibility at the enterprise level for many of these initiatives across many disparate organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the major impact of some of those initiatives.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to count on somebody to stop me if I ramble on here because it's a big question in a broad space. So for starters, I think everyone's happy to see and report that the national cyber strategy and the defense cyber strategy are really pretty closely aligned. So yay, win number one. That's goodness. I won't tick through all of Mr. Deasy's, the DoD CIO, top 10 cyber initiatives. They're available in class online. But I think a fundamental tenet of what he's trying to do this POM and issue cycle and where his headspace is and where he's trying to lead the force is a more holistic approach. And I know that sounds hackneyed, and yeah, who wouldn't? But really a more holistic approach across the enterprise, the DoD enterprise, to how we're looking at cybersecurity. I think he's been foot stomping that, you know, in the POM and budget cycles, which are obviously out of sync and out of cycle with the technology advancement and evolution cycles, big challenge for the DoD, and I think for all of my peers here, just keeping pace with our existing mechanisms and processes. His foot stomping point has been, look, you can't piecemeal this. If we don't take an end-to-end look at cybersecurity to include workforce development and the systems and weapons platforms, we're not going to get there from here. And so within DISA, I'll just spend a second on what we're looking at tactically in my organization, and then a little bit more strategically that get after, I think, some of the tenets of his strategy. So tactically, we've spent the better part of the past couple of years now taking 10, 12 years worth of developmental and deployment work, a lot of it partnered with NSA at the perimeter and beyond, what's grown up as point solutions across the entire spectrum, and trying to better integrate those. It's been a lot harder than I would have projected at the onset, but the engineers are wrapping their mind around it. And I think we're finally seeing some opportunities for convergence, which again, I think is in keeping with the general cybersecurity marketplace, at least in the tools that we're deploying. So some tactical work there. I would offer that a challenge in that space, and I've spent some time in industry, so I empathize and I understand, but the solutions that are coming out tend to be very, very much proprietary integrated solutions, and that poses a big challenge for us in just data rights and ownership. So, you know, anything we can collectively do to advance that cause might take some creative thinking and some interesting business model changes. Lastly, on the strategic side, I would say that the two transformational things that I think are the biggest bang for the buck in my part of the mission space are getting after next generation identity. It's fundamental to everything we do. It's critical as we advance toward more automation and orchestration and, you know, human out of the loop decision making, which has to happen. And then, and we've got some interesting transformational things happening there that I'd love to chat about offline. And then secondly, how we're dealing with data rationalization and data sharing, whether we call it big data analytics, CSAC, whatever. If we don't get those two things right, we should probably just go home.
Go big or go home. You know, thank you very much, Lisa. So I think, you know, we've got some of the risk management perspective, engineering and tools perspective. Amy, you and I have had a discussion around a culture of awareness, the importance of policy and governance, making sure that, you know, the workforce is prepared as well. So could you describe a little bit about what HHS is doing with regard to some of those activities?
Great, thank you. So as I've been thinking about this conversation this morning, I was trying to craft a couple different themes around what I know is a super scintillating topic of governance policy and strategy, particularly when you sit amongst extraordinary colleagues who are really out often getting the bad guys and girls and trying to prevent them from accessing really important systems and mission-based activities. So from that vantage point, I would say a couple things. When we think about cybersecurity, and frankly, when we think about technology at HHS, one of the most important themes I try to talk about is that what we do needs to be two things and two things only, and if we do the two things, then we actually have an incredible runway. And the first is making sure that what we do is relevant. It's relevant to the business, it's relevant to the mission, it's relevant to the workforce, and because we are public citizens, it's relative and relevant to the American people. The second thing we need to do besides that is making sure it resonates. So if we are talking about technology to people who are running behavioral health programs, if we're talking about technology to folks who are working through child support enforcement activities, we need to speak in a language that is resonating with what they do, that it connects what we are about to what they are doing. And so in that space, I would say there's 4 major areas of activity that HHS is embarking upon. The first is in this cultural transformation world, making sure that, again, what we're doing, whether it's from a policy perspective, a governance perspective, or even a technology perspective, is relevant and resonates with our customer base. And we do that through thinking about our governance model. We start talking to people who are not just in the IT space, but we talk to our counterparts on the financial side. We engage our CFO community. We engage our budget community. We engage our acquisition community. Because when we're talking about addressing things like legacy technology, unsupported technology, these are discussions that have mission, business, and absolutely financial matters. And if you don't start talking about them early enough in the process, you end up not being able to take on things. And I loved the notion of the unicorn money. Haven't seen that in my 20-some odd years in government. Would love to hear more about it. But if that does not come to pass at the next CXO conversation, we do need to be planful about that. So using those other governance forums to help drive that home, and then linking other aspects of risk management. A123 is a great example. There are provisions in that that ask agencies to really look at their risk management portfolio. At HHS, we've incorporated cyber as one piece of that. Second area in terms of doing some transformative work, and that is linking this to business processes. Folks I know are familiar with the system development lifecycle. EPLC is what we call it at HHS for the enterprise performance lifecycle. We're trying to change that mantra to enabling performance across the lifecycle. And one of the key ways to do that is to start the cyber conversation earlier in the process so that people don't go through and think about building new things and deploying stuff and then at the end go, oh yeah, and I need that ATO thing. Oh yeah, I got to go figure that out. No. Let's talk about it at the front end, and let's talk about it in a way that the cybersecurity is the key component to being successful in the work you want to do. Because we're all about sharing information. We just need to figure out how to share it in a safe and secure manner with the right people who have the right access to the right information at the right time. So let's talk about that earlier. So we're trying to modify our processes to identify that and talk about it. From a financial perspective, we're trying to rope in this dialogue about legacy technology and unsupported technology into our budget reviews. From a CIO perspective, having that dialogue, again, a year, 2 years even before you get down the pike, and asking the question, what do you see is on your horizon? What are the key high-value assets that you have in place now that are, unfortunately, being vulnerable to cyber attacks because they do not have supported technology? And getting those folks that are really not in the IT space to have that conversation, bring that CIO person together. The workforce is another critical area. We cannot do this by ourselves. We must do it with extraordinary people who sit with us and work for us. We recognize at HHS we do have real critical gaps in the cyber workforce. We often have folks who are taking on cyber roles and responsibilities, not necessarily with all the critical academic certifications in place, and sometimes they're wearing 2 and 3 and 4 different hats. We can't change that reality, but we do need to have, as you indicated, a cultural awareness of that and create pathways so that these individuals, if they do get sparked and excited about this notion of cybersecurity, how can we make that happen for them in a professional setting, and how can we leverage their experience to teach others and to be a model for others? And how can they be a model for those around them that, again, do not do the IT thing? The last piece I would just mention is policy. And again, policy is, again, I would say, in some cases perhaps not thought of as the most hottest, exciting thing to talk about, but it is really a fundamental backbone to what we do. And you think about law, you think about policy, and then you think about business process, technology, people, and it is a continuum. So we are looking to see where do we have opportunities to strengthen our most fundamental policies, whether it's around cyber or IT governance or at large. We at HHS, like a lot of other federal agencies, have had the opportunity to engage with our GAO colleagues. They have provided us with an opportunity to understand where we have some opportunities for growth and development. We're looking at that holistically and in partnership with them to see where do we have these policy gaps and what are the steps we need to take at a departmental level and then at an operating division level to make sure we're closing those gaps in these key areas. We have the FITARA scorecard. That focuses on FISMA. That's an incredible opportunity in and of itself to take, again, a more holistic view, just like you said, Lisa, and bring in other communities to this conversation about cyber. So it's not just an IT thing, it's an everybody thing.
Thank you, Amy. We will have a unicorn panel, but you will not be able to see it. Mark, you and I had a discussion around, insider threat, personnel, people are still, one of the weaker links out there with regard to security and awareness. We also had a discussion a little bit about the use of analytical capabilities and AI to be more proactive with regard to looking at some of the indicators in our infrastructure, and a little bit about cyber hygiene. So can you describe what you and your team are doing with regard to those activities?
So that's a lot to talk through in 5 minutes, but let's just take this up a level and realize why we exist to do what we're doing. We all have a specific mission to go do, and NSA is one of those organizations where it's a Department of Defense organization, is also an intelligence community organization. So if the end goal is to protect the mission, looking at those systems that go do what the mission actually is. I've had a privilege of sitting on a panel yesterday talking more data focused. Again, I thought some of the speakers had taken my talking points because they were talking about the mission. The mission was completely necessarily unrelated to what our mission was. So if you take that look at why the IT infrastructure actually exists, and you want to do the mission correctly, which means you want to do it with a secure system, with secure people doing that mission, and you understand who those mission people are working the system, you have data on all that going through. NSA's mission is data. In order to look at the amounts of data we have to look at right now, we can't go do it with a human set of eyeballs. The volumes are ever increasing. A forum like this 20 years ago would have been each of you writing notes and maybe typing something up in an email. Well, now people are taking video of this and streaming this, and how much data is being created just out of this video session. So when you're then thinking about the mission and thinking about who's on those networks, you look at the data that's collected by those people performing the mission. Again, a security analyst cannot go look at that individually by itself and go figure out what's going on, which leads you then into automated intelligence and machine learning. Having somebody else create some algorithm to go look at the data to say, what is Mark actually doing on the network today? Is he doing what his job says he's supposed to be doing? Is he printing what he's supposed to be printing? Is he looking at the files he's supposed to be looking at? If I am, okay, allowed to go do that. If I'm not, then maybe I have another reason for doing what I'm doing, or maybe I don't. So that's the point where we're getting to, where we have to automate these additional processes on top of to look at people doing what they're supposed to be doing or not, or the machines themselves doing what they're doing or not. 3 tenets we look at when we're looking at insider threat and network security is, are you doing what's fundamentally right to go do? Even though the networks are more complicated than they ever have been, there are still some basic things you need to know what's going on in the network. You need to know who's on the network, you need to be authorized, to Lisa's point about the authentication and personal identification. You need to patch your network. If your network's inherently not secure, then why are you using that? Right? You all have cell phones. You all, when iOS tells you to update it, you go update it. Same applies to whatever other IT system you're using. Comprehensive. You just don't let something hang out that, okay, I might get to those 10 machines later on. No, when you're going to patch something, you're going to go do it completely. Look at it as an entirety. Look at your workforce as an entirety, and who's actually coming on those machines. Are they cleared, or do they have the responsibility to go do that? And remember, IT security is also more than just IT. There is physical security aspect of it, like who's going in the server rooms, right? Can you log who's going in the server rooms? Do you know, are they actually authorized to go be there? And then the third one is some focus measures. All IT systems are not created equal. You don't have the same logic and security as you do on your payroll system as you did on a weapon system. They're fundamentally different systems with fundamentally different missions. Therefore, the security of them should be different. So you do need to create focus measures for those individual systems as you put them online and you connect them to each other. So if you look at that holistic across the environment of doing the basics, doing it in total, but focusing it where you need to, you can cover everything you need to cover. Again, we'll take a talented workforce to go do that. But again, not everybody needs to be a smart IT to go do that. The security guard guarding your facility or looking at the access controls to your server room doesn't need to be an IT expert. They do need to know something, who's allowed in there. But again, looking at the right people to do the right missions is training. I'm an aerospace engineer by degree. I wasn't trained in IT. But 20 years later, after serving serving in the Navy as a nuclear engineer, I can figure out how to read an instruction and know do what I'm supposed to go do. So let's not undersell the people short too just because they're not trained in IT. They don't necessarily know that they can't operate safely on the networks.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. So we have about 2 minutes left. Is there a question that anyone from the audience would like to ask of the panel? Yes, sir. You've got a...
Thank you for all coming. I really appreciate it. And I wanted whoever would like to answer the opinion on the technology about blockchain these days. Everyone keeps talking about it, and of course, as we know, Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is not like blockchain, right? And do you think blockchain can actually solve the problem that the government has with identification or asset tracking or any other et cetera things that blockchain can be utilized? Because I believe that it will, and it's coming, and it's going to be disrupting a lot of sectors, and government could be potentially one of them. But I just wanted everyone's opinion on what you guys thought about blockchain.
I have one.
Okay.
I'll throw it out there, and you guys can glom on. So I would tell you that that we've got a group within DISA who's looking at what applications might make sense for blockchain, and one of our lead engineers. Technology leaders has said, you know, this is a solution looking for a problem in our space. Where are we going to put it? So I think there is an application for it going forward, particularly as we're looking at the identity aspect and how we distribute our networks and apply it to a defense in-depth perspective. In fact, later this afternoon, I've got a meeting with our seniors aimed at the angstiness over cloud, right? And so even as we're busily selling cloud and DoD and migrating to mil cloud and commercial cloud, you know, there's a very visceral feeling to, oh wait, you mean you're going to put our metadata in the cloud? No, that's a bad idea. No, it's not a bad idea. I mean, we're going to have to go there, and we are going to go there. I would offer that a blockchain-like approach to how we manage and protect the DoD key stores, or subsets of them, for example, are probably part of our solution at some point in the future in that space.
Thank you, Lisa. Are there any other comments from the panel? I think we have 1 minute left. I guess just one quick question to throw out there as well. Or are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
How are you looking at automating a DevOps pipeline? Like, how does that work?
Okay, I'll take that one, I guess. So what we're talking about there is kind of automating the security processes within the DevOps framework, right? So we have a DevOps pipeline that we run our capabilities through to help, you know, build those, assess those, do things like static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, dependency checks, you know, finding out, you know, are there dependencies out there that will break this app if we bring it into another environment where it's not going to have access to those. But so we do a really good job at building capabilities there. We want to do an even better job at integrating the security processes so that when something does come out of the DevOps pipeline at the end, it's ready to go. For us to remain ahead of our adversaries, we have to be better, but we got to be faster too, right? We got to be better and way faster. So I don't want to name any specific tools. I'm trying to avoid that actually. But we are. Let's say that we are very open to open source. You know, we do use some COTS products as well, but very open to open source products.
I think that's the end of the panel. I'd like to thank the panel very much for kind of giving the on-the-ground agency perspective for cybersecurity. Great dialogue here today about about what's going on at the strategic level. I think this gives the audience a good sense of some of the initiatives that are having an impact within your specific agencies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daryl. All right. Well,
thank you so much to everyone who joined us this morning. What a beautiful day that we have here. We're going to actually open up the patio again for breakfast and coffee. So great opportunity to meet some of the colleagues here, some of the government and industry leaders that attended this morning. But I want to again, everybody for joining us. I especially wanted to thank our sponsors who made this possible, ID Technologies, Cylance, and APCO Worldwide. Thank you again for your support in making this a possibility and allowing us to have such a great venue like we do this morning. So I'll make one last pitch. We're going to have our next artificial intelligence event with CXO Tech Forum. We're going to have it here again. We're going to have it on November 13th. So please look for information about that. I know we ran out of tickets for folks today, so make sure that you take a look and sign up early rather than wait, so we can have make sure everybody has an opportunity to join us. But thank you again. I hope everybody learned something and got a chance to meet somebody that you haven't met before and learned a little bit more. All right. Thank you very much.